So we do see the repercussions of what happened in East Central Europe and the Soviet Union on a global scale. We can also start conceptualizing East Central Europe as a node in a larger set of global transformations.
You're listening to the Transformative Podcast, brought to you by the Research Center for the History of Transformations at the University of Vienna.
You're listening to an in-house edition of the Transformative Podcast today with me, Rosamund Johnston, and my colleague and superior here at RECET, Jannis Panagiotidis, with whom, alongside 6 other editors based at RECET over the past 4 years, I've been working on the Routledge Handbook of 1989 and the Great Transformation. And today, Jannis and I would like to give you a first glimpse of that following its release with Routledge on the 1st of January this year. So Jannis, thank you very much for joining me today.
Happy to be here.
As someone who has been involved in this project from the very, very beginning, perhaps you would be best placed to talk about the conceptual foundations on which this handbook was built.
This handbook in its whole genesis and conceptual outlook is really closely tied to RECET as such, which takes this broad perspective on transformation. And of course, the title of the handbook already contains a thinly veiled hint at our main inspiration. 1989 and the Great Transformation, of course, refers to Karl Polanyi's work on the Great Transformation, published in 1944. Obviously, Polanyi was not talking about the transformations we're looking at around the year 1989, but he provided a certain conceptual framework that he developed against the backdrop of the emergence and collapse of the classical liberal order in the 19th century and first half of the 20th century. There are some key mechanisms there that he identified which are helpful for understanding some of the key processes in this regard. He called them the double movement, so a simultaneous movement of marketizing and protectionist forces in society, or as he also called it, disembedding and re-embedding forces, which on the one hand aim to impose the market as the main or the sole mechanism of social organization on society. And on the other hand, you have society resisting these trends. This is something that Polanyi wrote from the vantage point of someone who had seen liberalism collapse, who had seen the emergence of fascism as one response, but also the emergence of what he called embedded liberalism. So essentially the modern welfare state, as you could already see it emerge in the 1930s, United States with the New Deal, etc. We're talking about something that you could frame as a second great transformation, for which the year 1989 is of great importance as a pivot, if you will, in a long-term development that we argue already started in the 1970s, with the advent of neoliberalism, so a second coming of liberalism, so to speak, and its rise and global spread, which definitely reached an important point in 1989 when the socialist world collapsed. And when we say 1989, of course, we mean 1989 till 1991 and the end of the Soviet Union. But basically, we're talking about the point in time when socialism, state socialism, is the main alternative to liberal capitalism disappeared, or mostly disappeared, at least from the European continent, and liberalism in its neoliberal guise achieved an important high point of its development.
So actually one of the things you just mentioned there was this kind of time frame with 1989 being crucial, but maybe not all explanatory or all-encompassing in and of itself, and that actually leads us to kind of the 4, I suppose, main takeaways that we as editors kind of found amassing these 40-plus chapters of the handbook that all these different authors were kind of pointing to, which was somewhat decentering 1989 as this crucial moment for understanding the dynamics of a transformation, great or otherwise, that took place, at this time. As you mentioned there, the 1970s really seems to be a kind of interesting alternative starting point, and a starting point that many of the authors to this handbook wanted to flag in terms of thinking through different economic ideas, in terms of political reform. If you decenter East Central Europe and the revolutions of 1989 and you look instead at Southern Europe and the kind of democratic revolutions that took place there then. And then if we kind of want to complicate or blur 1989, and I think there are some good reasons, we'll discuss this further, for doing so, then we also find that it maybe isn't this clear and sharp break in important ways, that socialism and the legacies of socialism, the built environment, some of the thinking, some of the connections, international connections that had been fostered during that socialist period continue to really matter beyond this 1989 moment and shape the, again, dynamics or contours of this great transformation that we see taking place in East Central Europe and beyond over these years. And I would say those are kind of two of the more temporal, I suppose, findings or arguments that we came to with this handbook. But maybe you want to talk about, there were a couple of spatial ones that we kind of came to distill, and maybe you want to round up what those were and what their significance is.
The spatial implications are, to some degree, of course, tied to these temporal implications. So by extending the timeline to the 1970s, we necessarily look beyond East Central Europe and we consider a global scale. So the rise of neoliberalism was a global development. It had to do with global economic trends, with the oil crisis, also with challenges from the decolonizing world in the guise of the new international economic order, which was perhaps a main contender to this emerging neoliberal order. And at the same time, when we talk about 1989 and what followed, it is very helpful to look at East Central Europe in comparison with other regions in the world where transformations did take place, where economic transformations in particular did take place, but perhaps political transformations not to the same degree. And the main case in point here is, of course, China, which is almost like a natural experiment of what could have been East Central Europe transforming under capitalist auspices, but without the communist power giving up its grip on political power. This is one main comparison we have here in the handbook and also here at RECET more generally. But of course, it's also interesting to look at other parts of the world. Latin America, for instance. We have one contribution by Rafael Pedemonte on Cuba, which of course was also affected by what happened in East Central Europe and in particular in the Soviet Union, which used to be the main sponsor of Cuban socialism. But importantly, and this is something that comes out of Pedemonte's article and already, or once again, complicates the timeline, Cuba already had its problems with Soviet reforms since 1985, so with perestroika, the reforms of Soviet communism within the communist system. So we do see the repercussions of what happened in East Central Europe and the Soviet Union on a global scale. We can also start conceptualizing East Central Europe as a node in a larger set of global transformations. East Central Europe, in many ways, became an important testing ground, if you will, for some of the neoliberal ideas that were in the air at the time, which had already been applied to some degree in developing countries through mechanisms of structural adjustment, and which, through these transformations post-89, came back to the European continent, maybe entered the European continent in the first place, which then also had repercussions for not just for East Central Europe, but for the wider continent and the West with a capital W, which is a process that Philipp Thaer, who's the founder of RECET and one of the editors of this handbook, also has termed co-transformation. So the transformation in the East did not leave the West untouched. On the contrary, this then shows us how East Central Europe really occupies an important space in this longer trajectory from the 1970s up until the present.
Which is so important because very often looking at or writing about East Central Europe sort of suggests that it is in some way an outsider to many kind of more global debates and discussions. And for example, some of the authors talk about transformation is often used instead of the term globalization to discuss what's taking place in the 80s and the 90s in this region. And our handbook emphatically makes the argument through a range of different perspectives for looking at events in East Central Europe as parts of broader global processes over those years. We kind of broke it down into 8 different sections, I suppose. After, saying 1989 isn't the be-all and end-all, we actually open the handbook with a section of articles on the significance or relative insignificance of the year 1989 around the globe, and that was edited by our colleague here, Sheng Pen, before then taking quite a Polanyian structure really to thinking about the different aspects of this transformation. So thinking first of all about economic transformations, edited by Anna Kalori, and societal or social transformations, which was a section I edited, kind of seeing them in some ways as maybe preceding the political transformations that occurred quite abruptly in some cases around East Central Europe in 1989 and in the Soviet Union in 1991. And then we also have some sections that are maybe more the strengths of RECET and not something that Polanyi himself focused so much on. So specifically, they're thinking about cultural transformations and intellectual transformations, and then migration, which is something that at RECET we have done a great deal of research into. And it's not something that was so highly flagged by Polanyi as being a kind of important component of thinking about the great transformation. And so, I suppose I could talk a little bit more about the process, but I think that what might be more interesting than that is kind of what emerged as we put together these 48 chapters over 4 years through a series of workshops. And so I don't know, Jannis, if you maybe want to talk about some of the things that became quite apparent that we had missed in the way that we structured this handbook and had originally put it together.
Well, yeah, it's once you've completed 550 pages of handbook, it's of course most fun in a way to think about what you didn't cover in this massive enterprise, because surprisingly or unsurprisingly, there are still some gaping holes, you could say, in the analysis, one of which is the issue of war and conflict. It's not completely absent, to be fair, especially to our colleagues like Jelena Đurenović working on former Yugoslavia, where obviously war and the aftermath of war is absolutely crucial for understanding this period. But still, by and large, we're not talking so much about war. In a self-critical perspective, one could say that we are perhaps operating in this post-89 mode of thinking more about as the post-Cold War period as an era of peace, where we could reap the peace dividend, which in an academic sense would probably mean not having to talk about war, but talking about all these other things that we're discussing. Of course, this illusion has come crashing down at the very latest in February of 2022 with the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I guess if you were paying attention before, it came crashing down before, and perhaps one never had this illusion. But be that as it may, war and conflict certainly, if we were to redo this handbook, or if we had started conceptualizing it after February of 2022, would certainly play a much bigger role than it does now. A second issue that is somewhat absent is the environment, which perhaps should have already been more obvious to us or in 2020 when we started planning, and also because it was, of course, an important issue already for contemporaries in the 1980s. And there are interesting analyses that suggest that environmental degradation was actually one of the main factors contributing to the downfall of state socialism, which is with its non-sustainable economies in a way. And of course, the simultaneous questions about, the limits of growth as a fundamental challenge to the whole capitalist economic model, which we are, I guess, debating these days under different circumstances and with different terminologies of green transformation, which is something we had a festival about here at RECET, which is not something that is very prominent in this handbook. And I guess a third issue, which is not a gap, but more like something that actually made it into the handbook, even though we didn't plan on it so much, is the issue of populism. This is something that came up in more than half of the contribution without us asking the authors to talk about it. And that, of course, has to do with what's happening in the region. It has to do with the emergence of self-declared illiberal regimes, such as Orban's government in Hungary, Kaczynski government in Poland, and so on. This is, of course, something that, if you look at it from the point of view of Polanyi's analysis again, is really something that confirms how relevant his paradigm is for the analysis of this era, precisely because this populism or this illiberal backlash against neoliberal reform, but also against liberal institutions, can be understood as a counter movement in the Polanyian sense, as a re-embedding movement, which doesn't necessarily mean that all these illiberal regimes aren't capitalist or anything, but it has something to do with sort of an entrenching of the nation, for instance, as an important frame of governance. And it has to do with a certain way of talking about protection of the nation, of the people, and so on, which finally, I think, also underscores an important point, and namely that this re-embedding that Polanyi talks about, these protectionist forces are not necessarily the good guys in history. There's a very conservative or even reactionary element, or can be a reactionary element in these re-embedding movements. Of course, in the historical example, Polanyi also wrote about the emergence of fascism. So in that sense, it's no surprise that nowadays, once again, we're debating whether some of the current forms of governments that have emerged in different places, including the United States, are or aren't fascist. I'm always a bit skeptical with using the sort of the exact historical terms and looking for exact analogies in histories. It's more about thinking about certain structural similarities perhaps, and this way we can perhaps start developing a new vocabulary that allows us to better understand what is happening now.
So you were absolutely right to bring up populism and populism as a debate, right? Throughout this handbook, there's not necessarily kind of one definitive answer offered to the reader. In fact, I would say there's a lively debate taking place across its 550 pages over whether populism is a helpful term, for example, to understand the current moment, and whether it is, as you say, in this sort of Polanyian model, a kind of counter movement or some backlash based on some economic and social reforms that have taken place over the past 30 or 40 years. And that's the other, I think, kind of important debate that comes up that I wanted to flag over the pages of this handbook, which is about what this transformation period is or was, whether it is complete, whether it is not. You mentioned 2022, the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine as being a kind of endpoint in some interpretations. That's certainly the interpretation, for example, of Philip Ter, and that would be the argument of Nino Ivazishvili-Gene and Ilona Grabmaier, also that this is a moment which has now closed. But also you'll find in these pages Ned Richardson-Little and Felix Jimenez-Bota, for example, talking about human rights, and 1989 being this high point, right? And ultimately really the end of that kind of human rights having a great moral authority and a great kind of chance to, what should I say, shape the thinking of meaningful political alternatives that they've been deployed ever since, but with dwindling returns. So I think, the handbook is full of debates, specifically to do with periodization. However, I think we can go beyond saying we complicate issues, and it is complicated, towards saying that maybe one of the findings we have is that transformation taking place at different tempos in different places, or perhaps indeed even within the same space. For example, if we look at the very local level, which my chapter does a little bit, at sort of different privatized parts of the same state-owned enterprise, for example. So I think those would be the kind of early takeaways that we as editors might suggest you can look forward to in the handbook. So with those questions open rather than closed, we invite you very much to read the handbook, and thank you very much for listening to this sneak preview of it on the Transformative podcast. Join us next time for another episode.